What if I told you that some of the most terrifying moments in British history didn't happen in distant battlefields, but in courtrooms, kitchens, ships' holds, and quiet village lanes? What if the order everyone praises was sometimes just violence with paperwork? And what if the people who suffered were asked afterwards to be grateful for it? Tonight we're walking through 101 disturbing moments, not as a parade of misery, but as a guided tour of how power behaves when it thinks nobody is watching. We'll lean on documented laws, diaries, parliamentary arguments, newspapers, and the stubborn physical evidence that survives fires, floods, and official embarrassment. If you want more long, calm British history for sleep, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Those small clicks tell the algorithm to keep the lantern lit. Now breathe a little slower. Let the modern world fade, and step with me into the moments Britain prefers to file away, rather than face. Moment 1. The harrying of the North, 1069-1070. In the winter of 1069, William the Conqueror faced rebellion in northern England, a region that had never quite agreed to be conquered in the first place. The setup sounds like a standard medieval problem: an angry population, a new king, a few uprisings. The pivot is what William chose as the solution. Instead of merely punishing leaders, the Norman response became something closer to scorched earth policy: villages burned, crops destroyed, livestock taken or slaughtered, food stores ruined. Contemporary chroniclers describe famine following the campaign, and later writers remembered it as a deliberate breaking of the region's ability to resist. We have to be honest about the medieval evidence. Numbers are disputed and chroniclers exaggerate, but the pattern is not in doubt. The North was made to understand that resistance did not earn negotiation. It earned emptiness. And when you destroy the means to live, you don't just defeat rebels, you defeat everyone. Moment 2. York's Jewish massacre at Clifford's Tower, 1190. York, 1190. The city is tense and the tension has a direction. England's Jewish communities are legally useful, especially as moneylenders in a society where Christians are often restricted from charging interest, but they are also politically convenient targets. The setup is a familiar medieval cocktail: crusading fervour, debt, rumours, and a crowd that wants a single simple villain. The pivot is that the villain is your neighbour. A mob, fueled by anti-Semitic preaching and local grievances, attacked the Jewish community. Many sought refuge in the royal castle, at what we now call Clifford's Tower. The siege that followed ended in catastrophe. Contemporary accounts describe mass deaths, including suicides to avoid forced conversion or slaughter. The disturbing part is not only the violence, it's the way debts and hatred can dress themselves as holy duty. When the crowd is convinced it is doing righteousness, it stops asking who benefits, and the people who benefit are rarely the people in the crowd. Moment 3. The expulsion of England's Jews, 1290. By 1290, the machinery of English government had learned a brutal trick. It could squeeze a community for revenue and then pretend moral purity when it was done. The setup is bureaucratic. Jewish communities are taxed heavily under royal authority. They are restricted, watched, and periodically attacked. At the same time, the crown profits from their presence, directly and indirectly. Then the pivot arrives with a proclamation. Edward III expelled England's Jews in 1290. Families were forced to leave the country, their property often seized or sold under pressure. The official language framed it as correcting wrongs, as if England was cleaning its conscience. But the reality was simpler. The state had learned how to borrow money and build credit systems without needing the people it had previously relied upon. Expulsion wasn't morality. It was the moment the nation decided it could get what it wanted without keeping its promises to those it used. And speaking of promises, Britain becomes very skilled at making them sound sacred, right up until they become inconvenient. Moment 4. The traitor's death. As a public entertainment, 1300s, 1600s, there are executions, and then there are executions designed as theatre. The setup is legal. Treason is the ultimate crime against the monarch, the body of the state, the idea of order itself. In theory, punishment is deterrence. The pivot is that deterrence becomes spectacle. For centuries, the penalty for high treason in England, especially for men, could involve hanging, drawing, and quartering. It was not one death, but several stages of pain, planned to last long enough for the crowd to see every lesson. Heads were displayed on spikes. Body parts were sent to different towns, like official mail. We know this from legal statutes, official records, and eyewitness descriptions. The language is sometimes chillingly neat, as if dismemberment is simply a clerical process, and the consequences went beyond fear. When the state makes cruelty public, it trains the population to accept cruelty as normal. It teaches people that suffering can be part of governance. Moment 5. The Black Death and the Violence of Blame, 1348-1351. The Black Death arrives like a darkness that doesn't knock. The setup is catastrophe. Plague kills on a scale medieval Europe has never seen. Whole households vanish. Priests, labourers, merchants. Death doesn't care about rank, even if society does. The pivot is that fear looks for a face. Across Europe, including in parts of Britain, communities searched for someone to blame. Rumours of poisoned wells and conspiracies spread. Minority groups, outsiders, and the already disliked became targets. Even when English Jewish communities had largely been expelled decades earlier, the logic of scapegoating remained ready to deploy against migrants, the poor, the unclean, the suspicious. Historical records show that plague also triggered harsh labour laws and social controls afterward, as elites tried to force wages down and stability back into place. Suffering didn't soften power, it sharpened it. And once a society learns to answer crisis with punishment, it reaches for punishment again and again, like a hand going automatically to a familiar weapon. Moment 6 after the peasants' revolt, mercy with a rope, 1381. In 1381, the peasants' revolt shakes England. It begins with tax anger, but it grows into something deeper. Resentment at feudal obligations, resentment at inequality, resentment at being treated like a resource rather than a person. The setup looks almost hopeful for a moment. Rebels march, officials panic, and the young king, Richard II, meets them. There are promises. There is talk of reform. Then the pivot comes, as it so often does when the danger passes. Leaders are hunted down. Trials follow. Executions follow the trials, like night follows day. The state that briefly negotiated now reasserts itself through punishment, making sure that anyone watching learns the right lesson. You may speak, but only until we decide you've spoken enough. The evidence is in official proclamations, court proceedings, and chroniclers, who recorded the reversal with the grim practicality of people used to seeing hope punished. At least a battlefield ends when someone wins. A crackdown can keep going until the winners feel satisfied. Moment 7. Towton. A battle where the killing didn't stop. 1461. Wars of the Roses battles are often described like dynastic chess. Noble houses, shifting loyalties, crowns traded like valuables. But Towton, fought in March 1461, is a reminder that chess pieces are made of flesh. The setup is civil war. Two sides claim legitimacy. Both insist God prefers their banner. The pivot is the scale. Contemporary accounts and later analysis point to Towton as one of the bloodiest battles fought on English soil. The numbers vary. Medieval casualty counts are always uncertain. But the consensus is that thousands died. Fighting took place in brutal conditions, and many were cut down while fleeing. The slaughter didn't stop politely when the outcome became clear. We know about Towton from chronicles, excavations, and the physical evidence of trauma on remains. Bones don't lie about blades. The disturbing truth is that civil wars are not only about who rules, they are about what a society permits itself to do to itself when it's convinced the other side is not truly us. Moment 8. The Pilgrimage of Grace and the State's Answer, 1536 to 1537. Henry VIII's England is often served as drama. Wives, executions, religion rewritten by royal appetite. But beneath the court intrigue is something colder. The state learning how to discipline entire regions. The The setup is a massive uprising in the north, the pilgrimage of grace, sparked by religious change and economic pressure. People march under banners of faith, but also under the practical demand to stop policies that are ripping their communities apart. The pivot is the Crown's response after promising talk. Negotiations buy time. Then the crackdown arrives. Leaders are executed. Others are hanged in clusters, public, visible, unforgettable. The message is not only obey, it's we know exactly how to make your neighbours watch. This is documented through state correspondence and judicial actions. The language is administrative, which somehow makes it worse. When violence becomes routine, it picks up the tone of routine. And speaking of routine, England is about to institutionalise hunger in a way that feels almost modern, because it's policy, not passion. Moment 9, the dissolution of the monasteries and the new crime of poverty, 1536-1541. The dissolution of the monasteries is sometimes framed as a triumph of reform or royal authority. But to ordinary people, monasteries are also infrastructure, places that provide relief, food, basic care, and a form of social safety net. Imperfect, yes, but real. The setup is religious and political. Henry VIII breaks with Rome. Monastic wealth looks like both temptation and threat. The pivot is what happens after the doors close. When monasteries are dissolved, lands and treasures move upward, into the hands of the crown and the well-connected. Meanwhile, the poor lose a familiar source of aid. In the same centuries, vagrancy laws sharpen, and the state increasingly treats poverty as suspicion, then as a moral failure, then as a punishable condition. We know this from legislation, local records, and the visible rise of harsh penalties for sturdy beggars. Hunger doesn't disappear. It becomes criminal. And once poverty is a crime, the state doesn't need to fix it. It only needs to punish it. Moment 10. The Marian Burnings, 1555-1558. Mary I inherits a kingdom split by faith and frightened by change. Her aim is restoration, to return England to Catholicism after Protestant reform. The setup is ideological. Officials insist they're saving souls, not harming bodies. The pivot is that saving souls involves setting people on fire. Between 1555 and 1558, Protestants are burned at the stake for heresy. The victims include ordinary believers and prominent figures, and the public nature of the executions matters. Fire is slow. Fire is visible. Fire is meant to teach. This is well documented in contemporary accounts and later compilations that turned the burnings into political memory. It becomes propaganda for Protestants afterward. A warning story that survives for centuries. The uncomfortable part is that persecution doesn't require monsters. It requires certainty, and Britain will keep discovering that certainty can justify almost anything, especially when it comes with a court seal. Moment 11. Plantation Ireland. Land theft with legal language, 1600. Colonization is often imagined as ships crossing oceans. Sometimes it's a surveyor crossing a field. The setup in Ireland is a long conflict over sovereignty, religion, and land. By the early 1600s, especially after the 9 Years' War, English policy turns toward plantation, settling English and Scottish Protestants on land taken from Irish Catholic owners, particularly in Ulster. The pivot is the paperwork. Confiscation is framed as law. Titles are rewritten. Communities are displaced not always by immediate massacre, but by the steady pressure of new ownership, new courts, new rules that always seem to favour the newcomers. Historical records show this through grants, maps, and correspondence that treats human lives as units attached to acres. Resistance is met with suppression, and resentment is stored like dry timber. The consequence is not only land loss, it's a reshaping of identity and division that will echo for centuries, turning neighbours into categories, and categories into targets. Moment 12. Drogheda, 1649, when example means slaughter. In 1649, Oliver Cromwell arrives in Ireland with the English Parliament's army in a landscape already brutalised by years of war and rebellion. The rhetoric is righteous. The aim is control. The setup is military. Drogheda, a fortified town, resists siege. The pivot is what happens when it falls. Accounts from the period describe mass killing of the garrison and others after the breach. Cromwell himself wrote of it as judgment, a warning to other towns, an example. The exact scale and specifics are debated by historians, but the essential fact is clear. The violence was not only tactical, it was communicative. A message written in blood travels faster than any messenger. The consequence is psychological as much as physical. It deepens hatred, hardens identities, and makes later reconciliation harder because memory becomes a weapon. And if you think that was the worst Britain could do on its own islands, remember, the Empire is waiting in the wing. Moment 13. The bloody assizes after Monmouth, 1685. The Monmouth Rebellion of 1685 fails. That part is quick. The punishment is not. The setup is political anxiety. A failed uprising suggests instability, and the state's instinct is to make instability painful. The pivot arrives in the courts. Judge Jeffreys presides over what becomes known as the bloody assizes. Trials move through the West Country. Sentences are severe. Executions, transportation, crushing financial penalties. The point is not only justice as law, it is justice as performance. We know this from trial records and contemporary commentary that remembered Jeffreys with a kind of fearful disgust. Even in an age used to harsh punishment, this campaign stood out, and the consequence is a lesson repeated through British history. The state does not only punish what you did, it punishes what it fears you might inspire. Moment 14. Slavery's British Account Books, 1700s. British slavery is sometimes spoken about like it happened elsewhere, as if distance cleanses involvement. But the paper trail says otherwise. The setup is commerce. British ports, Liverpool, Bristol, London, profit from the transatlantic trade. Companies, investors, and institutions grow wealthy. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, rum, everyday comforts fed by extraordinary cruelty. The pivot is the banality. Enslaved people appear in ledgers as cargo. Ships are insured, losses are calculated, plantation profits are tallied. The violence becomes not only physical, but administrative, a system designed to turn human suffering into reliable return. This is documented through shipping records, plantation correspondence, and the financial archives that still exist, because money is carefully preserved. The consequences stretch across centuries, wealth accumulated, lives destroyed, societies shaped around extraction. And when abolition comes, the next disturbing twist is this: compensation is paid, but not to the enslaved, to the enslavers. Moment 15. The Zong Massacre, when murder became an insurance claim, 1781. In 1781, the slave ship Zong becomes infamous not because it was uniquely cruel, but because its cruelty became a legal question. The setup is horrifyingly practical. The ship is overcrowded, disease spreads, water runs low, profit is threatened. Then comes the pivot, cold, deliberate. More than 100 enslaved Africans are thrown overboard. The reason, argued afterward, is that cargo lost at sea might be covered by insurance in a way that deaths on board might not. The scandal erupts not because everyone suddenly agrees the murders are morally unbearable, but because the owners seek reimbursement. The case becomes a grim window into the system's logic. We know about it from court proceedings and abolitionist campaigning that used it to expose what slavery truly was. Not an unfortunate side effect of trade, but a trade built on the permission to destroy human beings. And speaking of permission, Britain becomes very good at exporting it, along with soldiers, administrators, and a firm belief in its own innocence. Moment 16. Transportation. A sentence that began with shackles, 1787 onwards. When Britain began transporting convicts to Australia in 1787, it was presented as solution. Prisons overcrowded, crime rising, a new colony needing labour. The setup sounds almost rational. The pivot is what the sentence meant in human terms. Transportation was exile, often for petty crimes, followed by a voyage that could be months of confinement, disease, violence and despair. Officially, it was punishment and reform. In practice, it could be a pipeline of cheap labor, enforced by distance and brutality. This is documented in ship logs, court records, and the letters and memoirs of those who endured it. Some survivors built lives, many did not. For women, the vulnerability to exploitation was constant. For men, the system was designed to break resistance before land was even sighted, and the moral sleight of hand was elegant. Britain could claim it was not executing people, it was simply removing them from the story. Moment 17. The Highland Clearances, 1700s–1800. The Highlands are often romanticized. Tartan, mist, noble clan. The clearances are the moment the romance is evicted. The setup is economic change. Landowners decide that sheep and later deer are more profitable than tenants. Improvement becomes the fashionable word, the kind that makes cruelty sound like progress. The pivot is enforcement. Communities are cleared from ancestral lands. Houses are burned to prevent return. Families are pushed toward coasts, crowded into poorer ground or forced into emigration. Some landlords offered assistance, others treated people as inconvenient furniture. We know this from estate records, eyewitness testimony, and the demographic shifts visible in censuses and migration patterns. The consequences are cultural as well as physical. Languages weakened, ways of life disrupted, memory sharpened into grievance. And if you think this is just Scotland's story, remember how often British improvement works. Someone improved, someone is removed. Moment 18, Peterloo, 1819, when Reform met Sabres Manchester, 16th August 1819. A crowd gathers, tens of thousands, demanding parliamentary reform in a Britain that insists it is the home of liberty while keeping much of its population unrepresented. The setup is peaceful. People arrive with families. Speakers talk of rights and representation. It is not a riot in its own mind. The pivot is the authorities' fear. Local magistrates order cavalry to arrest speakers and disperse the crowd. In the crush and chaos, people are cut down. The dead and injured include women and children. Contemporary accounts, including newspapers, describe the scene with the stunned clarity of people who expected argument and got blades. The name Peterloo itself is bitter sarcasm, an echo of Waterloo, as if the state fought its own civilians and called it victory. The consequence is not only trauma, it is the deepening suspicion that British stability often means this. You may ask for change, as long as you do it quietly enough not to be noticed. Moment 19. The Poor Law, 1834. Relief designed to hurt. If you want a disturbing moment that arrives without a single dramatic battle, look at 1834 and the new Poor Law. The setup is reform. Officials argue that old systems encourage dependency, that relief must be controlled, that the poor must be discouraged from seeking help. The pivot is the invention of deterrence as policy. Workhouses become the center of relief, and conditions are deliberately harsh. Families separated, diets thin, discipline strict. The principle of less eligibility means life inside must be worse than the lowest paid labor outside, so that only the desperate will enter. This is documented in official reports, parliamentary debates, and the later investigations that exposed cruelty and neglect. The workhouse becomes a symbol because it was designed to be one, not a refuge, a warning. And speaking of warnings, the next one is written on small bodies, bent over machines that never get tired. Moment 20. Children in mills and mines, 1830s, 1840s. Industrial Britain is sometimes celebrated as a miracle of coal and iron. The miracle had a workforce. The setup is poverty and demand. Factories and mines need small workers for small spaces and repetitive tasks. Families need wages. Employers want obedience. The pivot is that childhood becomes an input. Children work long hours in textile mills, hauling and cleaning around dangerous machinery. In mines, boys and girls, sometimes very young, carry loads, open ventilation doors, crawl through narrow passages. Injuries, illness, and exhaustion are common, and when reformers and investigators begin documenting it, the details shock even people used to hardship. We know this from government commissions, testimonies, and early industrial records. The language of witnesses, children describing fear, darkness, beatings, cuts through any romantic picture of progress. The consequence is not only suffering, it is a lesson. When an economy is hungry enough, it will eat the young first. Moment 21. Newport, 1839. A rising, a crackdown, a message. In November 1839, Chartists in Newport, Wales march with the demand that keeps returning in British history: representation. The vote, a voice that counts. The setup is organised protest, shaped by petitions and meetings and growing frustration at being ignored. The pivot is gunfire. Clashes at the Westgate Hotel end with soldiers firing on protesters. People die. The leaders are tried for treason. Sentences are severe. Initially death, later commuted to transportation. This is documented through court proceedings and contemporary reporting. The pattern is also familiar. When the political system feels threatened, it reaches for the hardest legal language available. Treason is not just a charge. It is a way of declaring that your demand for rights is a form of war. And if you think that was harsh, remember the next crisis arrives not with banners, but with a fungus, and the choices Britain makes in response will be remembered as one of its most damning tests. Moment 22. The Irish famine begins. A natural disaster meets a political one. 1845-1846. In 1845, potato blight hits Ireland. The setup looks like nature. A crop fails and a population heavily dependent on that crop faces hunger. The pivot is that hunger becomes policy. Ireland is part of the United Kingdom at this point, governed through British institutions and shaped by landlordism, rent, and unequal power. Relief efforts exist, but they are tangled in ideology, beliefs about markets, morality, and the suspicion that helping too much will encourage poverty. Food continues to move through ports under armed guard while people starve nearby, not because nobody notices, but because the system insists that intervention must be limited. The evidence is in official correspondence, parliamentary arguments, and contemporary observers who recorded the grim contrast between export and starvation. Historians debate intent, whether this was deliberate cruelty or lethal indifference, but the outcome is not debated. People die because help is rationed by doctrine. And speaking of doctrine, the workhouse gates, already cruel in England, become, in famine Ireland, the narrow doorway between life and collapse. Moment 23. Black 47, workhouses, fever, and the price of deserving help. By 1847, the Irish famine has a name that feels like a verdict. Black 47. The setup is not only hunger now, but the collapse of ordinary life. Labour disappears because bodies are weak. Rent still exists because paper doesn't starve. Families sell what they can, then what they should never have to sell, and then they sell the last thing, time, by walking toward relief with whatever strength remains. The pivot is that the main relief mechanism is designed to deter. Workhouses are overwhelmed. The conditions are crowded, and crowding means disease. Fever thrives where people are packed together and underfed. Even where administrators try to keep order, the system's logic pushes cruelty forward. Separation of families, strict rules, and the constant moral judgment about who is deserving. A starving person does not become less hungry because an official looks suspiciously at them, but suspicion becomes a tool to limit costs, and cost becomes the silent god of policy. Historical records show that mortality in workhouses and fever hospitals can be staggering in these years. The details vary by region, and the data is imperfect, but the shape is clear. A society facing mass suffering chooses mechanisms that make help feel like punishment, and the consequence lasts longer than the hunger, because when people survive an event like that, they do not simply recover. They remember who locked the door and who argued about the price of unlocking it. Moment 24. Evictions during famine when the roof becomes optional, 1846-1851. As the famine deepens, another pressure continues without shame. Rent. The setup is a landlord-tenant system in which land is wealth and tenants are replaceable. Even in normal years, it's hard. In famine years, it becomes murderous. The pivot is eviction. Families already weakened by hunger are put out. Sometimes cottages are levelled or roofs torn off to prevent re-entry. People shelter in ditches, in makeshift huts, or on roadsides. Fever spreads. Children die with the weather, not just the hunger. In some cases, landlords support relief or assisted emigration. In other cases, they treat eviction as housekeeping. We know this from estate papers, court records, and contemporary accounts, both Irish and British, describing clearances that intersect with famine so closely it becomes hard to separate them. The question of intent is debated in scholarship, but the result is not. Displacement on top of starvation accelerates death. And speaking of displacement, Britain's answer to suffering often comes with a ticket. Sometimes it's sold as opportunity. Sometimes it's simply a quieter way to remove the problem from view. Moment 25. Coffin ships and the deadly geography of escape. 1840s, 1850s. Emigration during famine can sound like a hopeful word. Escape. The setup is a desperate family selling what little remains to pay for passage. A ship. A chance. The pivot is what that ship can become. Overcrowded vessels carrying emigrants, especially the poorest, can be riddled with disease, short on sanitation, and poorly supplied. Conditions vary widely, and it's important not to reduce every voyage to one horror story, but the documented tragedies are real. Fever spreads quickly in tight quarters. Deaths at sea are common enough that the phrase coffin ships enters popular memory, capturing the fear that the journey out might kill you before the New World has a chance to. Records from port authorities, ship manifests, and contemporary observers show recurring patterns of sickness and mortality. Some ships are better run, many are not. And the cruel irony is this: the people who most needed a safe passage were often the least able to pay for one. The consequence is an emigrant history shaped by grief, not just hope. And once a society learns that it can solve a crisis by exporting its sufferers, it starts applying that logic elsewhere, into prisons, into colonies, into institutions that exist mainly so the comfortable don't have to see discomfort. Moment 26. The Crimean War. Disease as the biggest killer. 1853, 1856. The Crimean War is often remembered for heroics and blunders. Charge of the Light Brigade. Romantic images of soldiers in distant lands. The setup is imperial rivalry and alliance politics, the kind of war that sounds grand in speeches. The pivot is that the enemy most soldiers meet first is not Russian artillery. It is filth, cold, and disease. Conditions in camps and hospitals are appalling. Contemporary reports and later investigations reveal overcrowding, poor sanitation, inadequate supplies, and administrative chaos. Mortality from disease dwarfs mortality from combat in many phases. Florence Nightingale's role becomes famous not because she invented compassion, but because the baseline was so low that basic hygiene looked like revolution. This is documented through official reports, military correspondence, and statistical analysis compiled after the war. And it's disturbing because it shows a pattern. The British state can be capable of immense organisation when it wants to be, yet repeatedly fails its own soldiers through neglect, wrapped in bureaucracy. And speaking of bureaucracy, we arrive at a moment when Britain decides that empire can be expanded not only by ships and soldiers, but by paper, treaties, proclamations, and maps that slice through lives. Moment 27. The Indian Rebellion and the Violence of Retribution, 1857, 1858. In 1857, rebellion erupts in India against East India Company rule. The setup is complex: military grievances, cultural and religious anxieties, economic exploitation, and a long build-up of resentment. There are atrocities committed by rebels. There are atrocities committed by British forces. The pivot is the scale and tone of retribution. British reprisals after the uprising are brutal, and they are often described in language that turns violence into cleansing. Summary executions occur. Villages are punished collectively. The infamous method of execution by blowing from guns is used in some cases, an execution designed not only to kill, but to terrify, and to violate religious sensibilities about the body. We know this from military records, contemporary journalism, letters, and later histories that argue fiercely about interpretation. The moral complexity is real, but the disturbing pattern is also real. When empire feels threatened, it reaches for exemplary cruelty and then justifies it as restoring order. Order, in this sense, means the ability to take without being challenged, and the consequences are long. Direct crown rule replaces company rule, but the fundamental dynamic of domination remains. Moment 28. The scramble for Africa. Lines drawn, lives broken. 1880s, 1900. There are disturbing moments that happen in rooms with maps. The setup is European competition, conferences, treaties, and the imperial belief that land belongs to whoever can claim it convincingly. The pivot is that Africans are treated like an afterthought in their own geography. British colonial expansion in Africa involves war, coercion, and the imposition of new borders and systems. Sometimes the violence is immediate: military campaigns, forced labor regimes, punitive expeditions. Sometimes it's structural: taxation designed to force wage labor, land seizures, legal systems that treat indigenous people as subjects rather than citizens. Documentation exists in colonial archives, parliamentary debates, missionary reports, and the testimonies of those who experienced and resisted rule. The details vary across regions and colonies, and no single narrative covers all. But the disturbing truth is consistent. Empire often framed itself as civilization, while extracting wealth and controlling bodies. And speaking of bodies, the next moments include the state watching, measuring, locking up, and calling it health, morality, or science. Moment 29. Jack the Ripper and the City's Indifference, 1888. Whitechapel, 1888. The setup is a city that prides itself on grandeur while allowing desperate poverty to fester in plain sight. The victims are women on the margins, often poor, often precarious, often treated as less worthy of protection. The pivot is not only the murderer's brutality, it's the environment that made it possible for those women to be vulnerable and then to be sensationalized. Contemporary newspapers report the murders with a mix of horror and lurid fascination. Public attention becomes a kind of appetite. Authorities struggle or fail to catch the killer, and debates swirl about policing, class, and the conditions of East End life. Some evidence is clear, much is disputed. Modern speculation often outpaces what can be proved. But one thing is not disputed: the social context mattered. When a society treats certain lives as disposable, it creates shadows deep enough for predators to hide in, and the press, hungry for stories, can make those shadows feel like entertainment. Moment 30. The workhouse. Scandals, starvation, and neglect behind walls. 1800s. Workhouses were meant to be deterrent. The setup is the poor law system insisting that poverty must be managed through discipline, not generosity. The pivot is when that discipline becomes cruelty and neglect. Throughout the 19th century, scandals erupt. Reports of inmates underfed, mistreated, worked beyond strength, denied medical care, and punished harshly. Specific cases become infamous in public discourse, often because a death or an investigation forces the truth into view. Parliamentary debates and newspaper reporting reveal how often the system only reforms after embarrassment. The disturbing part is not that every workhouse is a dungeon. Some are run more humanely than others. The disturbing part is that the system's design makes suffering useful. If relief is unpleasant, fewer will seek it. So neglect becomes not a bug. It becomes a feature that conveniently keeps the numbers down. And speaking of numbers being kept down, Britain enters a century where bodies are counted in new ways. Soldiers, workers, colonized subjects, and where industrial modernity makes death more efficient. Moment 31. The Titanic. Class and the Shape of Survival. 1912. The sinking of the Titanic is usually framed as tragedy and hubris. The setup is technological confidence, a ship marketed as marvel, a floating symbol of wealth and progress. The pivot is how class shaped who lived. Survival rates differed dramatically between classes. Access to lifeboats, proximity to decks, the speed at which warnings reached cabins, these weren't distributed evenly. Women and children in some classes were prioritized. In others, chaos and barriers limited escape. The disaster becomes a mirror, reflecting how society organizes bodies even in panic. This is documented through passenger lists, inquiry reports, and survivor testimony. The ship sinks in the Atlantic, but the social structure stays upright to the end. And the grim consequence is this: even when disaster looks random, the outcomes often follow patterns that were built long before the crisis. Meanwhile, on land, the state is about to feed millions of men into machinery that makes medieval slaughter look intimate. Moment 32. The First World War. The Somme and the Mathematics of Loss, 1916. The Battle of the Somme is often summarized by one number. The casualties on the first day, 1st July 1916. The setup is an offensive intended to break enemy lines and relieve pressure elsewhere. There is optimism in planning documents, a belief that artillery bombardment will clear the way. The pivot is the reality of modern war. Men climb out of trenches into machine gun fire. Whole units are cut down in minutes. The day becomes a symbol not only of loss, but of command misjudgment, of strategies that treated soldiers as numbers to be spent. We know the Somme through official military records, diaries, letters, and the statistical breakdown that makes the horror both clearer and, strangely, more abstract. The numbers are so large they almost resist comprehension, and yet each number is a person who had a voice, a body, a home. The consequence is generational trauma. Villages lose their young men. Families lose futures. The state learns and then keeps repeating the same lesson. Modern war can devour an entire society's heart faster than it can replace it. And if you think the horror ends when the armistice is signed, remember, peace can be violent too, especially when it arrives with unemployment, influenza, and a government terrified of revolution. Moment 33. The 1918 influenza. A Quiet Mass Grave, 1918-1919. As the First World War ends, another killer moves through Britain and the world. Influenza. The setup is exhaustion. Populations weakened by war, crowded in cities, moving in trains and ships. The pivot is the speed and invisibility. Unlike a battlefield, influenza does not announce itself with shells. It arrives as fever, cough, collapse. People die at home, in hospitals, in barracks. Records show enormous mortality, though exact numbers vary by region and reporting. Contemporary newspapers sometimes underplay it, partly due to wartime censorship and partly because society struggles to narrate sickness the way it narrates heroism. The disturbing aspect is that mass death can happen without the dramatic structure we expect. No medals, no victory parade, just empty chairs at tables. And speaking of empty chairs, the interwar period will see Britain wrestling with poverty and power again, often choosing to manage the poor rather than uplift them. Moment 34. The general strike and the fear of the working class. 1926. The general strike of 1926 begins with miners and expands into a nationwide stoppage. The setup is economic hardship, wage cuts, longer hours, and a working class increasingly aware of its collective power. The pivot is how the state responds to the idea of organized labor. The strike is met with emergency planning, propaganda, volunteer labor to keep essential services running, and an atmosphere that frames workers not as citizens bargaining for survival, but as a threat to national stability. The strike ends after 9 days, but the miners' struggle continues longer, and the outcome is bitter. This is documented through government records, union papers, newspapers, and memoirs. The disturbing part is not that conflict exists. Conflict is inevitable in unequal societies. The disturbing part is how quickly the language turns from British workers to dangerous agitators when those workers demand more than survival. And speaking of turning language into weapons, the next moment involves law itself, written not to protect, but to contain. Moment 35. The Vagrancy Act. Legacy. Poverty as policing. Ongoing shadow. Some disturbing moments don't have a single date. They have a long afterlife. The setup is that Britain, over centuries, repeatedly criminalizes visible poverty. Vagrancy laws, poor laws, policing powers, tools designed to move people along, to make certain forms of desperation illegal. The pivot is that the goal often isn't safety, it's aesthetics. It's the desire of the comfortable to not have to look at the consequences of economic structures. Legal categories become nets: vagrant, idle, rogue. The wording shifts across centuries, but the instinct remains recognizable. This is documented through legislation and enforcement patterns. And the disturbing consequence is that the state's response to suffering becomes reflexively a response to the sight of suffering. If you cannot solve poverty, you can at least hide it. Meanwhile, across the sea, Britain's imperial system will face challenges that reveal, again, how quickly power reaches for punishment when control slips. Moment 36. Amritsar. The Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, 1919. April 1919. Amritsar, India. The setup is political tension, post-war unrest, protest against repressive laws, and a colonial administration anxious about rebellion. The pivot is gunfire into a trapped crowd. At Jallianwala Bagh, troops under Brigadier General Reginald Dyer fire on unarmed civilians gathered in an enclosed garden. People have limited exits. Panic crushes bodies. The dead and wounded numbers are disputed. Official figures and Indian accounts differ, but the massacre itself is not in doubt. We know this through inquiry reports, witness testimonies, and the political fallout that follows. Dyer becomes a symbol, condemned by some, defended by others who see him as the man who saved British rule. The disturbing part is that a massacre can be interpreted as both atrocity and triumph, depending on what side of power you stand on. And speaking of triumph, Britain's next war will demand unity again. Yet unity has its own dark undercurrents, including who is protected, who is bombed, and who is sacrificed quietly. Moment 37. The Blitz and the Myth of Equal Suffering, 1940-1941. The Blitz is remembered as Britain's shared ordeal. Londoners in tube stations, cities burning, stoic resilience. The setup is real. German bombing campaigns kill thousands, destroy homes, and leave deep scars. The pivot is that suffering isn't shared equally. Working-class areas often face heavier damage due to industrial targets and dense housing. People without access to safe shelters face greater risks. Racial and immigrant communities sometimes experience hostility even as they contribute to the war effort. The myth of perfectly equal stoicism can hide these differences. This is documented through bombing statistics, social surveys, diaries, and later historical analysis. None of this diminishes the bravery of ordinary people. It simply refuses the comforting lie that war makes everyone the same. War compresses inequality. It doesn't erase it. And if you think the story of wartime Britain is only one of heroism, remember, in the same years, the state is also making decisions about famine elsewhere, decisions that will haunt Britain's moral record. Moment 38. The Bengal famine. Imperial priorities in a time of war, 1943. In 1943, Bengal suffers a famine that kills millions. The setup is wartime disruption, Japanese advances in Asia, supply problems, inflation, and the vulnerability of a population living near the edge of hunger, even in normal years. The pivot is policy and priority. Debates continue among historians about the precise balance of causes: crop issues, market failure, wartime shipping constraints, administrative decisions. But what is documented is that relief was inadequate and delayed, and that imperial wartime priorities shaped responses. Grain movement, price controls, shipping allocations, and political considerations became fatal variables. We know this through government records, contemporary journalism, and later scholarship. The disturbing truth is that famine in an empire is rarely natural. It is mediated by human decisions: who gets resources, who is believed, who's considered strategically important. And speaking of being believed, Britain's post-war period will include moments when survivors of institutional abuse try to speak and find that the system prefers silence. Moment 39. Post-war care institutions abused behind respectable walls, 1900s. The word care can be one of the most disturbing disguises in history. The setup is a network of institutions, children's homes, borstalls, psychiatric hospitals, long-stay facilities, designed, at least on paper, to protect and reform. The pivot is the repeated evidence of abuse, neglect, and cruelty. Across the 20th century, investigations and survivor testimonies reveal patterns: beatings, humiliation, exploitation, inadequate medical treatment, and systems that punish those who complain. Not every institution is the same. Not every staff member is abusive. But the pattern of power concentrated over vulnerable people, combined with secrecy and stigma, creates a recurring hazard. Documentation comes from inquiries, court cases, journalism, and survivor accounts. The disturbing consequence is that harm can persist for decades because the victims are the very people society is most willing to doubt. And speaking of doubt, Britain's relationship with violence at home continues into the late 20th century, including moments where the state's fear of disorder produces responses that widen wounds instead of closing them. Moment 40. Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, 1972. 30th January 1972, Derry. The setup is a civil rights march amid escalating conflict in Northern Ireland. People protest against internment and discrimination. The atmosphere is tense, but the march itself is not armed. The pivot is the shooting. British soldiers fire on civilians. People die. The event becomes one of the defining traumas of the Troubles. The details of responsibility and narrative are fought over for years, but later investigations conclude that many of those shot were unarmed and posed no threat. This is documented through eyewitness accounts, media footage, and official inquiries. The long-term consequence is not just grief, it's radicalization, mistrust, and a deepened sense that British power on the island can operate with lethal force and then argue about it for decades. And speaking of decades of arguing, some disturbing moments don't end when the violence stops. They end when the truth is finally admitted, if it ever is. Moment 41. Hillsborough, disaster, blame, and the long war for truth, 1989. 15th April 1989, Sheffield. The setup is a football match, a normal Saturday for thousands. Crowds arrive, police manage entry, the stadium fills. The pivot is a crush that becomes fatal. 96 people die in the immediate tragedy, with later developments regarding the death toll in subsequent years. The disaster itself is horrifying, but the disturbing moment extends beyond the stadium. The attempt to shift blame, the smearing of victims, the years of families fighting for accountability. This is documented through inquiries, legal proceedings, journalism, and the persistence of families who refused to accept convenient narratives. The consequence is a case study in how institutions protect themselves, not always with a single lie, but with 1,000 small evasions. And speaking of evasions, the next set of moments returns us to an older British habit. When the state is embarrassed, it often reaches for secrecy first and justice second. Moment 42. The dirty war language. When states call it security, there's a particular kind of danger that arrives when governments stop speaking plainly. The setup is always the same. A genuine threat exists, fear rises, and the public demands protection. The pivot is the vocabulary. Words like security, order, intelligence, and national interest begin to function like blank checks. Actions that would be scandalous in daylight become acceptable if they're wrapped in secrecy and stamped urgent. Surveillance expands, informers multiply, mistakes get renamed operations, civil liberties become nice-to-haves, and when something goes wrong, the first instinct is rarely confession. It's not uniquely British, but Britain is exceptionally practiced at it, because the country has centuries of experience managing unrest, empire, and dissent with a combination of law and shadow. The most disturbing part is how ordinary it can look from the outside. Meetings, memos, committees, a calm voice saying, "We had to." Historical records and later inquiries repeatedly show the pattern. When secrecy becomes habit, accountability becomes optional. And once accountability is optional, suffering becomes predictable. And speaking of predictability, Northern Ireland offers one of the clearest examples of what happens when fear becomes policy. Moment 43. Internment without trial in Northern Ireland, 1971. Internment without trial sounds like an emergency measure, something temporary and regrettable. The setup in 1971 is escalating violence, political paralysis, and a state insisting it needs extraordinary tools. The pivot is how those tools are used. People are arrested and held without trial, often based on intelligence that is flawed, outdated, or shaped by bias. The policy hits communities unevenly, feeding the belief that the law is not neutral, but targeted. Families watch fathers, brothers, sons disappear into a system that offers no clear route to prove innocence, because the accusation itself is treated as enough. We know the outlines from official records, contemporary reporting, and later assessments that show internment inflamed tensions rather than calming them. It becomes a recruitment gift to paramilitaries and a trust destroyer for the state. The disturbing part is not only that innocent people can be caught, it's that the system is designed so that caught is the point. The spectacle of arrest becomes its own message. We can take you, and you can't stop us. Meanwhile, when violence escalates, the courts are expected to mop up the moral mess, often years later when the damage is already permanent. Moment 44. The Birmingham Six. Justice built on pressure and prejudice, 1970s-1990s. After the Birmingham pub bombings in 1974, the setup is public horror and political desperation. The country wants answers and the authorities want someone to hold. The pivot is what happens when someone becomes more important than true. 6 Irish men are convicted. The case becomes infamous because of the allegations and later findings around coerced confessions, questionable forensic claims, and a wider climate of anti-Irish prejudice. Years pass, decades almost. Eventually, the convictions are quashed. This is documented through appeal proceedings, investigative journalism, and the slow accumulation of uncomfortable facts that refused to stay buried. The disturbing part is not that the system made one error. It's that the system had incentives to keep the error in place. Admitting the truth would mean admitting that the state, under pressure, could punish the wrong people and then defend itself for years while they lost their lives to prison walls. And the consequence isn't only what happened to those men, it's what it taught everyone else. If fear is high enough, your innocence can become negotiable. And speaking of negotiable innocence, another set of cases shows how easily a whole narrative can be built out of flimsy parts if the public is ready to believe it. Moment 45. The Guildford 4 and the Maguire 7, a machine that kept running. The setup is similar: bombings, panic, and a political atmosphere hungry for swift certainty. The pivot is that certainty is manufactured. The Guildford 4 and the Maguire 7 become symbols of wrongful conviction. Cases shaped by dubious confessions, unreliable evidence, and a justice system that, once committed to a story, struggles to let go. The details are documented in legal proceedings and later investigations that exposed how fragile the foundations were. What makes it disturbing is the layering. First comes the initial failure: bad policing, coerced statements, tunnel vision. Then comes the institutional failure: appeals resisted, warnings ignored, inconvenient facts treated like nuisances. It isn't only that the system can be wrong, it's that the system can prefer being wrong to being embarrassed. The human consequence is years stolen, families shredded, reputations damaged in a society that often assumes conviction equals guilt. And when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't come with a time machine. It comes with a thin apology and an enormous silence about who, exactly, should be held accountable. But the authorities weren't done yet, because when the state faces dissent at home, it can treat its own citizens with the same suspicion it once reserved for colonies. Moment 46. Orgreave, 1984. A battlefield in a mining village. Orgreave, 1984. The setup is industrial conflict, the miners' strike, communities fighting for livelihoods, and a government determined to break a union it sees as a political enemy. The pivot is the policing. Clashes between police and picketers become infamous for their intensity and for allegations that the state used force and then shaped the narrative afterward. People are arrested, charged, and later see cases collapse. Years later, debates about accountability simmer precisely because the event feels like something larger than a scuffle, like the state testing how much pressure it can apply before the public calls it what it is. This is documented through court outcomes, media footage, testimony, and later scrutiny that raises uncomfortable questions about how evidence was presented and how violence was explained. The disturbing aspect is not only the batons, it's the message behind them. When economic policy is contested, the contest can be reframed as disorder, so force becomes restoring calm rather than crushing opposition. And speaking of crushing, the miners' strike is a reminder that you can destroy a community without firing a shot. You just close the pit and wait. Moment 47. The miners' strike. When a community is treated as an enemy, 1984 to 1985. The miners' strike is often narrated as politics, but the setup at ground level is painfully basic. A town built around a pit, a wage that keeps food on a table, and the knowledge that closure means slow death. The pivot is that the dispute becomes moralized. Miners are framed as threats, not workers. Their families are framed as collateral. The language hardens, the enemy within vibes, except now the enemy is people who know what their labor is worth. Communities experience policing, media hostility, and economic pressure that stretches beyond the strike itself. When pits close, unemployment rises, local economies hollow out, and the social damage spreads through decades. We know this from economic data, community testimony, and the visible after effects in health, poverty, and opportunity. The disturbing part is that the destruction is not accidental. It is a strategy. You break organized labor not only by winning a dispute, but by making the cost of future resistance feel unbearable. And if you think the violence of British history always wears a uniform, remember, sometimes it wears a suit and carries a briefcase. Meanwhile, there are tragedies where the state doesn't swing the baton. It simply fails to do the obvious thing, and children pay the price. Moment 48. Aberfan, 1966. The mountain that fell on a school, Aberfan, 21st of October 1966. The setup is a Welsh mining village living beneath tips, heaps of coal waste stacked above homes and a school. People had worried, warnings existed. Danger wasn't invisible. The pivot is that nothing meaningful is done until it's too late. A colliery's spoiled tip collapses after heavy rain, sending a slurry of waste into the village. It engulfs buildings, including a school. Children die. Families are shattered in minutes. The horror is immediate, but what makes it disturbingly British is the bureaucratic aftertaste, the slow grinding of responsibility, the arguments about blame, the defensive instincts of institutions. This is documented through inquiries and official findings that point toward negligence and systemic failure. The tragedy is not a mysterious act of nature. It's an engineered hazard left in place because it was convenient. The consequence is a scar that never fades, and a lesson that should have been learned the first time humans started stacking waste above a classroom. If you treat risk as someone else's problem, the risk will eventually introduce itself. And speaking of risks treated as manageable, Britain's empire produced entire systems where harm was not an accident. It was a method. Moment 49. Mau Mau detention and torture, empire's order in Kenya, 1950s. The setup in 1950s Kenya is rebellion, land grievances, and a colonial administration determined to keep control. The pivot is what control looks like when it stops pretending. During the Mau Mau uprising and its suppression, Britain's colonial system uses detention camps and coercive measures that later become the subject of fierce historical and legal scrutiny. Survivors describe forced labor, beatings, and torture, Officials justify harshness as necessary. The language of emergency does heavy lifting, turning extraordinary cruelty into routine procedure. We know about this through colonial records, later investigations, and survivor testimonies that refuse to disappear. The disturbing part is the familiar pattern. The empire insists it is civilizing, and then, when challenged, responds with methods that cannot be reconciled with civilization unless you redefine the word to mean whatever keeps us in charge. The consequence isn't only the suffering inflicted, it's the way memory and accountability are delayed. Years pass, decades pass, files become lost or misplaced, and the victims are expected to age quietly into silence. But if you think that was confined to one colony, remember, Britain ran multiple emergencies and the playbook travels well. Moment 50, the Malayan emergency, resettlement, control, and the cost of stability, 1948-1960. The setup is insurgency in Malaya, a colonial economy, and Cold War anxieties. Britain frames the conflict as maintaining order against communist forces. The pivot is population control as strategy. In counterinsurgency, civilians become the terrain. Villages are resettled. Movement is restricted. Food supplies are controlled. The aim is to separate insurgents from support, but the means often treat whole communities as suspect by default. In this kind of war, the line between security and punishment blurs until it barely exists. Documentation comes from colonial archives, military histories, and the lived experience recorded in various accounts over time. The disturbing part is how soft the language can sound. Resettlement, regulation, emergency measures. It's tidy phrasing for messy human reality. Families uprooted, livelihoods disrupted, fear turned into routine. And the consequence is not only what happens in Malaya, it's what Britain learns, that control can be achieved without admitting you're at war with civilians. You can call it administration and let the paperwork do the screaming. And speaking of paperwork screaming, there's another modern British horror that doesn't look like violence at first glance, until you realise what it did to ordinary lives. Moment 51. The post office. Scandal, a system that made innocent people guilty. Here's a disturbing moment that arrives without blood on the floor. At first, the setup is trusted routine. Local postmasters and postmistresses running branches, balancing accounts, living ordinary lives. The pivot is a technological and institutional failure treated as moral failure. Errors in accounting systems lead to apparent shortfalls, and instead of assuming the system might be wrong, the institution assumes the humans are thieves. People are prosecuted, bankrupted, socially ruined. Some are imprisoned. Many are forced into desperation, their reputations shredded in towns where reputation is everything. This is documented through court cases, investigative reporting, and later legal reversals that show the scale of failure and the stubbornness with which it was defended. The disturbing part is how long it takes for a large institution to admit it might be wrong, especially when admitting it would be expensive and humiliating. It's the same old pattern in a modern suit. Protect the system, sacrifice the individual, and then act surprised when the sacrifice refuses to stay invisible. And if you think that was bad, remember, sometimes the state doesn't need a broken computer to ruin lives. Sometimes it only needs a crowd. Moment 52. The Gordon Riots. Religion, Fear, and London on Fire, 1780. London, 1780. The setup is anti-Catholic agitation, political anxiety, and a city packed tight with grievances. A protest becomes a movement becomes a mob. The pivot is how quickly moral outrage turns into permission to destroy. The Gordon Riots erupt into days of violence, prisons attacked, homes and chapels targeted, streets effectively seized by chaos. The state responds with military force. People die. The city witnesses how thin the veneer of order can be when fear and prejudice are stirred with enough skill. This is documented through contemporary accounts and official responses that show both the scale of destruction and the panic of authorities who suddenly realized that the capital can become ungovernable. The disturbing part is not only the rioting, It's the lesson that a society can be pushed into frenzy with remarkably little, a rumour, a sermon, a slogan, and suddenly your neighbour is your enemy and your conscience feels like a drum. And speaking of drums, Britain has long known how to turn moral panic into law, especially when the target is convenient, strange, or powerless. Moment 53. Witch hunts in Britain. When fear became a court case, 1600s. Witch trials are often remembered as medieval, but some of Britain's most intense episodes happen in the 17th century, during civil war and social upheaval. The setup is instability, communities strained by conflict, poverty, illness, and the need to explain the unexplainable. The pivot is the creation of a legal pathway for paranoia. Accusations become evidence, gossip becomes testimony. Signs are interpreted by self-appointed experts. Once a person is labelled a witch, everything they do becomes suspicious by definition. The machinery of justice, meant to find truth, becomes a funnel that turns fear into verdict. We know about these trials from court records and contemporary pamphlets that both sensationalized and normalized the process. The victims are often women on the margins, though not exclusively, and the cruelty lies partly in how communal the violence is. Neighbours accuse neighbours. Families participate in destruction because destruction feels safer than doubt. The consequence is not only the dead, it is the precedent that in a frightened society, law can be retooled into a weapon against the vulnerable and called protection. Meanwhile, if you think Britain left this habit behind, consider how often later moral panics recycle the same structure. Only the vocabulary changes. Moment 54. The slave compensation moment. Paying the perpetrators, 1830. Abolition is often told as a moral victory, and in many ways it is. The setup is decades of campaigning, testimony, activism, and the growing recognition, finally, that slavery is indefensible. The pivot is who gets paid when the system ends. In the abolition of slavery across much of the British Empire, compensation is paid to slave owners for their loss of property. The formerly enslaved, who lost freedom, family, bodily autonomy, and often life, are not compensated in anything like the same way. The state chooses to soften the economic blow for perpetrators, as if the true injury in the story is financial rather than human. This is documented in official financial records and parliamentary actions. The disturbing part is not that governments worry about money, it's that the moral accounting is inverted. The people who did wrong are treated as victims of reform, and the people wronged are expected to accept freedom as sufficient payment for everything stolen. And speaking of inverted accounting, empire doesn't only extract labour and land, sometimes it extracts addiction, then calls it trade. Moment 55. The Opium Wars, Profit as Policy, 1800s. Britain's involvement in the opium trade and the Opium Wars is one of those moments that forces the polite story of civilization to sit down and be quiet. The setup is commercial. Britain wants goods from China, tea, silk, porcelain, and faces an imbalance of trade. The pivot is the solution. Sell a drug. Opium, grown largely in colonial India, becomes a commodity used to pry open markets. When Chinese authorities try to restrict the trade, conflict escalates into war. The language used at the time can dress it as diplomacy or rights of trade, but the underlying reality is hard to soften. Coercion, violence, and the demand that another society accept addiction and exploitation because it benefits British interests. This is documented through diplomatic correspondence, parliamentary debates, and the historical record of war and treaty. The disturbing consequence is not just what happens in China, it's what it reveals about empire. When profit is threatened, morality becomes negotiable, and gunboats start talking. And if you think gunboats are the darkest symbol of British power, remember, sometimes the most disturbing weapon is not the cannon. It's the confidence to declare your violence reasonable. Moment 56. The Black and Tans, Counterinsurgency and Collective Punishment. In the Irish War of Independence, the setup is a familiar imperial crisis. an organised movement challenging British authority, and a government desperate to reassert control without looking weak. The pivot is a particular kind of policing, militarised, angry, and often undisciplined, unleashed into communities already on edge. The Black and Tans, alongside other forces, become infamous for reprisals, raids, burnings, beatings, and collective punishment. The details vary by incident and source, and propaganda existed on all sides, but the overall pattern is documented in contemporary reporting, witness accounts, and the political fallout that helped poison any remaining trust. The disturbing element is not only the violence itself, it's the logic behind it. If you can't separate insurgents from civilians, you treat civilians as potential insurgents. Every home becomes suspect. Every village becomes a lesson. And once punishment is collective, innocence becomes irrelevant. And speaking of innocence becoming irrelevant, Britain has a long history of making examples, sometimes in public squares, sometimes in administrative corridors. Moment 57. The no Irish need apply. Era. Hostility as a national habit. Not all disturbing moments involve a single massacre. Some involve a repeated message delivered quietly, day after day. The setup is Irish migration to Britain, driven by famine, poverty, political pressure, and the search for work. Cities absorb newcomers, and newcomers become useful as labour. The pivot is how easily usefulness turns into contempt. Anti-Irish sentiment appears in job notices, housing discrimination, and social hostility. It intersects with religious prejudice and class fear. The phrase "no Irish need apply" has a complicated historical footprint. Some argue it's more mythologized than universally literal, but the underlying discrimination is well attested in contemporary accounts, satire, and the lived reality of Irish communities who faced suspicion and mockery as routine. The disturbing consequence is cultural. Prejudice becomes normal enough to feel invisible, and when prejudice is normal, it becomes available, ready to be activated whenever the state or press needs a scapegoat. Meanwhile, across the empire, Britain's confidence in its own legal superiority continues to collide with the reality of what its legal systems actually do on the ground. Moment 58. The Boer War Camps, a modern concentration system, 1899 to 1902. The Second Boer War is often told as imperial struggle in South Africa. The setup is military conflict, guerrilla tactics, and a British desire to break resistance. The pivot is the camps. Britain establishes civilian concentration camps, primarily for Boer women and children, but also camps for Black Africans under different conditions and purposes. Disease, overcrowding, and inadequate supplies lead to high mortality. Emily Hobhouse's reports help bring attention to the suffering, showing how the system's neglect becomes lethal. This is documented in official inquiries, reports, and later historical work. The disturbing part is not that war produces hardship. It's that the state creates a system that concentrates civilians, then fails to sustain life within it, and only adjusts when exposed. The camps demonstrate a modern idea. You can control a population by confining it, and you can call it necessity rather than cruelty. And if you think Britain learned from that, remember, the 20th century will keep testing how far states will go when they believe security outranks human dignity. Moment 59, the British Empire and forced labour. Development built on coercion. Imperial projects often present themselves as infrastructure, roads, railways, plantations, mines. The setup is the language of progress, development, modernisation, civilization. The pivot is the labour. Across various colonies and periods, coercive labour practices appear, forced recruitment, punitive taxation that pushes people into wage labour, harsh conditions that treat workers as replaceable. The specifics differ by colony and decade, and the historical record is uneven, but the broad pattern is well documented in colonial reports, missionary accounts, and the testimonies of colonised communities. The disturbing part is how flexible the moral argument becomes. If forced labour produces a road, the road becomes evidence of progress, and the suffering becomes a footnote, if it is acknowledged at all. And the consequence is not only physical trauma, It's a legacy of extraction, where wealth moves outward while lives are spent locally, and the empire congratulates itself for the railway. But the empire's most disturbing moments aren't always structural. Sometimes they are sudden, sharp, and utterly final. Moment 60, the Amritsar aftershock, rewarding the men who pulled the trigger after Jallianwala Bagh. The setup is outrage. Indians demand accountability. British liberals recoil. The empire is forced to look at itself. The pivot is that parts of Britain don't recoil. Public campaigns in Britain raise money to support Dyer, treating him as a hero who protected British rule. This is documented in contemporary press and political debate. It's a moment that reveals something chilling. Even when a massacre is acknowledged, it can still be defended if enough people believe the victims were the wrong sort. The disturbing consequence is the message it sends to colonized subjects. Your lives are negotiable, and when you die, your killers can be celebrated by people who have never met you. And speaking of killers celebrated, Britain's domestic history has its own versions of sanctioned cruelty, sometimes dressed as medicine. Moment 61. Asylums and treatment. When control masquerades as care, 1800s-1900s. The setup is real need. Mental illness exists, disability exists, and societies require ways to support vulnerable people. The pivot is how easily support turns into confinement. Asylums expand in the 19th century. They are framed as humane alternatives to older neglect. But overcrowding, underfunding, and the stigma around mental health create environments where restraint, sedation, and harsh discipline can become routine. Some institutions aim for genuine care. Others become warehouses for the inconvenient. We know this from medical reports, inspection records, and the later history of psychiatric reform. The disturbing aspect is not that every asylum was torture. It's that the system made abuse easy. When people are hidden away and labeled unreliable, their suffering becomes easy to deny. And once denial is easy, it becomes habitual. And speaking of habitual denial, there are moments when the British state's relationship with truth becomes so strained that it begins to feel like an adversary of memory itself. Moment 62. Official secrets. When government hides its own mistakes. Britain's culture of secrecy is not a single act. It's a long posture. The setup is statecraft. Intelligence needs protection. Diplomatic negotiations require confidentiality. War plans cannot be public. The pivot is when secrecy becomes a reflex to avoid accountability. Official secrets laws and the wider institutional habit of classification can protect genuine security. They can also protect reputations. They can delay justice. They can prevent scrutiny long enough for public outrage to fade. And when files are locked away, those harmed often face an extra cruelty. Not only the damage itself, but the slow, exhausting effort to prove it happened. The evidence for this pattern appears in later declassifications, inquiries, and the recurring discovery of files that remained sealed far beyond what was necessary. The disturbing consequence is that truth becomes an expensive commodity, accessible only to those with time, resources, and stubbornness. And speaking of stubbornness, some of the most haunting British stories are those where families spend decades fighting not for compensation, but for a sentence that simply says, "We did this." Moment 63. Bloody Sunday's long shadow. When justice takes generations, the setup is an event we already touched. Shootings, grief, outrage. The pivot is the time. For decades, narratives clash. Official accounts are challenged. Witnesses are doubted. Families carry photographs, names, and the heavy knowledge that the dead are not coming back. But truth still matters, because without it, the dead are insulted twice. Eventually, later inquiries and conclusions reshape the official understanding. This drawn-out process is documented in reports and public records, and the disturbing aspect is not simply delay. It is what delay communicates, that the state can outlast grief, that it can wait until witnesses age, until energy fades, until the fight becomes too exhausting for most people to continue. But some people continue anyway, and they force the truth into the light, even when the light arrives decades too late to heal. And speaking of delayed truth, Britain has another catastrophe where official narratives fought survivors and families for years. The tragedy is not only the event, but the insistence on controlling what it means. Moment 64, the Lockerbie aftermath. Grief, politics, and the weight of certainty, 1988 onwards. Lockerbie, 1988. The setup is a plane in the sky and a town on the ground. The pivot is sudden destruction. Pan Am Flight 103 explodes, killing passengers and people in Lockerbie. The investigation that follows becomes international, political, and prolonged. Evidence is debated. Trials occur. The story is heavy with grief and geopolitics, and it's important to acknowledge uncertainty where it exists, particularly in public debate about responsibility and the broader political context. The disturbing part is not that investigations are difficult. It's that in tragedies of this scale, the hunger for closure can become dangerous. When governments and publics demand certainty, the pressure can shape narratives. Survivors and families are left navigating not only loss, but the political use of their loss. This is documented through legal proceedings, public inquiries, and the long arc of reporting and dispute. The consequence is that tragedy becomes a battleground for story, not just a wound. Meanwhile, Britain's relationship with violence and authority includes another recurring pattern. When power is challenged, it does not always respond with open force. Sometimes it responds with starvation, economic, legal, or reputational. Moment 65. The enforced silence of whistleblowers, truth as a career ending. Whistleblowers are often romanticized as lone heroes, but the setup is usually mundane. Someone sees wrongdoing, financial mismanagement, abuse, dangerous negligence, corruption. They report it, assuming the system will want to know. The pivot is the system's response. Institutions often treat whistleblowers as threats, not assets. They are isolated, discredited, pushed out, and legally pressured. Even when later inquiries confirm their concerns, the price they paid rarely returns. This is documented across multiple British contexts, from public services to corporations, through tribunal cases, investigations, and the patterns visible in repeated scandals. The disturbing consequence is that systems become self-protecting organisms. They learn that punishing truth-tellers discourages truth, and if truth is discouraged long enough, the next scandal is guaranteed. And speaking of guaranteed scandals, Britain's colonial legacy includes moments where entire populations were treated as problems to be managed, sometimes with violence, sometimes with policy, always with the assumption that control was the natural right of the controller. Moment 66. Partition and its trauma. The shadow of British exit, 1947. Partition of British India in 1947 is one of the largest upheavals in human history. The setup is empire ending, political negotiation, communal tension, and a rushed attempt to redraw borders and create new states. The pivot is the speed and the human cost. Millions are displaced, violence erupts, families are torn apart, mass killings occur. The role and responsibility of British authorities in the rushed process, the boundary decisions, and the administrative unravelling is debated with intensity. But what is not debated is the trauma, the sudden transformation of neighbours into enemies, the terrifying journey of refugees, the scars that persist across generations. Historical records include official documents, memoirs, and the overwhelming testimony of survivors. The disturbing aspect is that empire can leave behind a bomb of uncertainty, then step away and call it independence. Freedom arrives, yes, but it arrives dragging a mountain of bodies behind it. And speaking of mountains of bodies, sometimes Britain's disturbing moments are not about empire or war. Sometimes they're about how easily a society can decide that certain people are simply expendable. Moment 67. Eugenics and improvement. When science became a social weapon. The setup is a word that sounds harmless. Improvement. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a certain mood takes hold in parts of Britain's intellectual and political world, an obsession with managing society as if it were livestock. This is the era when eugenic ideas circulate widely across Europe and North America, and Britain is not an exception. The pivot is how quickly science becomes an excuse for prejudice. Eugenics frames poverty, disability, mental illness, and undesirable traits as biological problems. It encourages policies and attitudes that treat people as burdens rather than citizens. In Britain, the conversation doesn't always translate into the same extreme legal programs seen elsewhere, but the influence is real. In debates about sterilisation, in institutionalisation, in the language used by reformers who believed they were being modern and rational. This is documented in published writings, social policy debates, and the institutions that adopted eugenic thinking as respectable. The disturbing part is not only the ideas, it's the way they flatter power. They allow the comfortable to believe inequality is natural, that suffering is inherited, and that compassion is inefficient. When you dress cruelty in data, it can walk into respectable rooms without being noticed. And speaking of respectable rooms, some of Britain's most disturbing moments happen not in back alleys but in Parliament, where a law can be passed that quietly destroys lives. Moment 68, the colour bar in Britain, racism as practice, not just opinion. The setup is post-war Britain, immigration, labour shortages and communities adjusting to change. The pivot is that racism becomes structured, housing discrimination, employment barriers, informal segregation, hostility that ranges from subtle to violent. People from the Caribbean, South Asia, Africa and elsewhere arrive to rebuild Britain, only to be told, sometimes explicitly, that certain streets, jobs, pubs or lodgings are not for them. This is documented through social studies, testimonies and the history of race relations in mid-20th century Britain. It's disturbing because it reveals the gap between national self-image and lived reality. A country that tells itself it's fair can still build daily life around exclusion, and the consequence isn't only economic hardship, it's psychological. Being made to feel foreign in the place where you are working, paying taxes, raising children, trying to belong. And speaking of belonging, Britain has a talent for deciding who counts as fully human depending on who is useful at the moment. Moment 69. Windrush. Invited, needed, then made illegal. The setup is straightforward. After the Second World War, Britain needs labour. People from the Caribbean and other parts of the Commonwealth are encouraged to come. They work in transport, hospitals, construction, building the post-war nation. The pivot is decades later when paperwork becomes a trap. People who arrived legally, lived legally, and built lives are suddenly told they cannot prove their status. They lose jobs, homes, healthcare access. Some face detention or removal threats. The cruelty here is administrative, not a baton in the street, but a letter in an envelope that turns a life into a problem. This is documented through governmental reviews, testimonies, and public scandal. The disturbing part is how easily a state can rewrite the meaning of someone's presence. A person can go from citizen in practice to illegal because the system decides to demand proof it never properly issued, and the consequence is trust collapsing. When you do that to a generation who answered Britain's call, you teach everyone else that belonging is conditional. But the state's ability to harm with paper has older roots, and one of the most chilling examples is the moment Britain invented a new category of suspicion, then built an apparatus around it. Moment 70. Enemy aliens. Fear turned into identity. 1914 to 1918. When the First World War begins, the setup is national panic and suspicion. Suddenly, nationality becomes a potential crime. The pivot is internment and hostility toward enemy aliens, people of German or Austrian origin living in Britain, including those long settled, married and integrated. Businesses are attacked, families are harassed, some are interned on places like the Isle of Man, swept into a policy that treats identity as risk. This is documented through official internment records and contemporary reporting. The disturbing part is how quickly a society can shift from tolerance to suspicion when war begins. Your neighbour's accent becomes evidence, your family name becomes an accusation, and the consequences linger. It sets a precedent for how Britain might treat outsiders in future crises. Meanwhile, war doesn't only create suspicion, it creates new ways of breaking bodies, and sometimes those bodies come back home, only to be handled like inconvenient reminders. Moment 71, Shell Shock and the Punishment of Trauma, 1914 and 1918. The setup is modern war's psychological injury, shell shock, what we now recognize as trauma responses to relentless bombardment and fear. Men shake, cannot speak, cannot function. Their minds collapse under conditions the human nervous system was never designed to endure. The pivot is how the system interprets it. In some cases, shell shock is treated with compassion and medical care. In others, it is treated as cowardice, malingering, weakness. Soldiers can be punished for symptoms, not crimes. Some are executed for desertion or cowardice in circumstances where later generations might see trauma and despair rather than moral failure. This is documented through military records and later historical research into disciplinary actions and medical understanding. The disturbing part is not only that war breaks mind, it's that the state can demand heroism, then punish the mind for failing to obey. And speaking of punishment, the British legal system has a long tradition of making fear into law. Sometimes it does it openly. Sometimes it does it by quietly defining new categories of dangerous people and then locking them away. Moment 72. The brutality of prison. When reform meant breaking British prisons in the 19th and early 20th centuries often sold themselves as reforming institutions, places to correct behaviour. The pivot is that correction frequently meant degradation, hard labour, solitary confinement, strict silence regimes, corporal punishment, nutritional deprivation. The prison becomes a machine for enforcing obedience, not healing wrongdoing. And within the system, the poor and the powerless face the harshest realities because they have the least access to influence or sympathy. We know about this through official prison records, reform campaigns, and the writings of those who experienced incarceration. The disturbing part is the philosophy that pain is morally purifying, that suffering equals improvement, that humiliation teaches virtue. It doesn't. It teaches fear and resentment. And speaking of resentment, there's a moment in Britain's imperial history where resentment becomes war, because Britain insists on a policy that turns a political conflict into starvation. Moment 73. The scorched earth. Logic repeats. Civilians as leverage from medieval Northumbria to colonial counterinsurgency. The setup repeats. Resistance emerges, power panics, and a strategy appears that targets resources rather than armies. The pivot is when civilians become leverage, destroy crops, restrict food, resettle villages, confiscate livestock, burn homes. The idea is that if you squeeze a population hard enough, they will stop supporting rebels. Sometimes it works tactically. Often it creates lasting hatred. The evidence for this pattern exists across multiple eras and conflicts, visible in military orders, administrative records, and the aftermath visible in communities uprooted or impoverished. The disturbing part is the moral calculus. Civilians are treated as an instrument. Their suffering becomes a tool. And if you think that's ancient history, remember, modern states still reach for these strategies because they are effective in the short term and devastating in the long term. Meanwhile, Britain's domestic modernity produces another category of disturbing moments, disasters where warnings existed, but action did not. Moment 74, the stadium, the crowd and the state's failure to protect. The setup is crowd management, sports matches, concerts, public gatherings. Britain loves a collective event. The pivot is when authorities treat crowds as a nuisance rather than a responsibility. From stadium tragedies to crushes and mishandled emergencies, the pattern, when it appears, is grimly familiar. Warnings ignored, safety corners cut, blame assigned downward, and families fighting upward for truth. Hillsborough is the most famous, but it's not the only example of how institutional reflex can prioritize reputation over responsibility. The disturbing aspect is not simply accidents. It's the second disaster afterward. The narrative battle, the insinuations, the attempt to make victims responsible for their own deaths. It's a cruelty that survives long after the sirens stop. And speaking of sirens, some British disasters happen at sea, where the gap between a promise of safety and the reality of cost-cutting becomes lethal. Moment 75. Sea disasters and the price of negligence, when safety is optional. Britain's maritime history is vast, and it includes heroism, but also a recurring tension, profit versus safety. The setup is ships as commerce, ferries, cargo vessels, trawlers, and the complex systems that keep them moving. The pivot is when oversight fails or corners are cut. In multiple incidents across modern history, investigations have pointed to preventable factors: poor safety procedures, inadequate equipment, miscommunication, management decisions that place schedules or savings above caution. The details differ from disaster to disaster, and each deserves its own careful treatment. But the disturbing pattern is recognizable. Tragedies are often unforeseeable. Only after someone ignored what was foreseeable. This is documented through inquiry reports and safety reforms that often arrive after lives are lost. The consequence is a bitter British lesson. Regulation is written in blood, and too often only after the blood is on the deck. And speaking of blood, there is a chilling thread in British history. The way public and official culture sometimes treated death not as tragedy, but as demonstration. Moment 76. Public executions, the crowd as participant. The setup is punishment. For centuries, Britain uses public executions as spectacle. People attend with families, vendors sell food. The condemned person's last moments become a kind of communal event. The pivot is what this does to a society. When death becomes entertainment, empathy erodes. The crowd participates in humiliation. The state weaponizes visibility. Executions are not only meant to kill the condemned, but to teach the living that the state holds the ultimate power over the body. This is documented in contemporary accounts describing the atmosphere and the huge gatherings. The disturbing part is not simply that people watched, it's that the system encouraged watching. It trained people to accept state violence as normal, and even to enjoy it. And when a society learns to enjoy the punishment of wrongdoers, it becomes easier to expand the definition of wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Britain's relationship with punishment continues to evolve. Less spectacle, more bureaucracy, but the underlying logic remains. If you can make suffering socially acceptable, you can apply it widely. Moment 77. The death penalty's long afterlife. Wrongful executions and regret. Even after public executions fade and the death penalty becomes more private, the setup remains. The state insists it can identify guilt with enough certainty to justify killing. The pivot is when that certainty breaks. Historical records include cases later believed to involve wrongful conviction. The names, details, and debates vary, and historians argue carefully about what can be proved. But the pattern is clear. Legal systems are human systems, and human systems err. When the penalty is death, error becomes irreversible. The disturbing consequence is that justice can become a permanent mistake, and the state's need for closure, the desire to finish a case, can overpower the slower, more honest work of doubt. And speaking of doubt, Britain's national myth often depends on forgetting doubt, especially about the empire. There's a disturbing moment in that forgetting, the way popular history can turn extraction into adventure. Moment 78. Empire as entertainment, when violence became a story for children. The setup is cultural. Adventure novels, exhibitions, school books, patriotic stories. Empire is presented as brave explorers and civilizing missions. The pivot is what gets omitted. The coercion, the land theft, the famines, the punishments, these become background noise or are erased entirely. Colonial violence is softened into pacification. Resistance is framed as savages attacking order. And British children grow up believing dominance is benevolent. This is documented in the era's popular literature and educational messaging. The disturbing part is that cultural narratives can be as powerful as armies. If you teach a population that empire is kindness, you make it harder for that population to recognize cruelty when it's committed in their name. And if you can't recognize cruelty, you don't resist it, you celebrate it. And speaking of celebration, Britain's self-image as a land of liberty often clashes with the reality of how it treated political radicals at home. Moment 79, spying on dissent. When democracy feared its own people, the setup is political anxiety. Radicals, suffragettes, labour organisers, anti-war activists. The state claims it must monitor threats. The pivot is the breadth of surveillance and infiltration. Over time, Britain developed systems to watch, record, and sometimes disrupt political movements. In some cases, easy infiltration extends into intimate spaces, with deep ethical violations that later become public scandals. The details vary by era, but the recurring pattern is that the state often treats dissent as a security issue rather than a democratic right. This is documented through declassified records, inquiries, and investigative reporting. The disturbing part is how normal it can feel inside the system. A report written, a file updated, a life interfered with, all under the assumption that order requires control. But in a democracy, control is meant to be accountable. And when it isn't, the line between protection and oppression becomes thin enough to tear. Moment 80. Suffragettes and force-feeding the state's war on women's bodies. The setup is a movement demanding a basic democratic right, the vote. Suffragettes, frustrated by being ignored, escalate tactics. Arrests follow. Imprisonment follows. Hunger strikes follow. One of the few tools prisoners have to reclaim agency. The pivot is the state's response, force-feeding. Women are restrained, tubes inserted, food pushed into bodies under coercion. The procedure is physically painful and psychologically violating. It is justified as preserving life, but it is also clearly a strategy to break resistance and deny the hunger strike its political power. This is documented in medical accounts, prison records, and the testimonies of suffragettes themselves, who describe the experience with a clarity that leaves little room for romanticization. The disturbing part is not only the violence, it's the intimacy of it. The state enters your body and calls it care. And the consequence is that suffragette struggle becomes not only about politics, but about bodily autonomy, how far a government will go to maintain control when persuasion fails. And speaking of control, Britain's institutions have a long tradition of punishing women, especially those considered fallen, in ways that turn morality into a cage. Moment 81. Magdalene laundries and moral punishment. Shame as labour. Across Britain and Ireland, institutions designed to reform women deemed immoral, unmarried mothers, promiscuous girls, women seen as troublesome, operated with varying structures and oversight. The pivot is that reform often meant forced labour and confinement. Women could be sent, sometimes by families or authorities, into laundries or similar institutions where work was punishing, freedom limited, and stigma used as a weapon. The specifics differ across regions and institutions, and the history is complex, but the broader pattern is documented through survivor testimony, records, and later investigations that reveal how morality became a mechanism of control. The disturbing aspect is the double cruelty. You are punished for the supposed sin, and then punished again by being told you deserved punishment. Shame becomes both the lock and the key, and the consequence is generational silence. Many survivors carried the story like a bruise they were told to hide. Meanwhile, if you think men were spared moral policing, remember Britain's other habit, turning sexuality into crime, and then treating punishment as public hygiene. Moment 82. Gross indecency. Criminalizing identity and destroying lives. The setup is Victorian and early 20th century moral law, statutes that criminalize male homosexuality, framed as protecting public decency. The pivot is how those laws destroy lives. Men are prosecuted, imprisoned, blackmailed, socially ruined. The fear becomes a constant background noise, shaping relationships and forcing secrecy. High-profile cases become warnings, but the majority of suffering is quiet. careers ended, families fractured, suicides implied but not always recorded. This is documented through court records and historical accounts of prosecutions. The disturbing part is that the law doesn't merely punish acts, it punishes existence. It makes identity a liability and then congratulates itself for being moral. And the consequences echo forward. The trauma outlives the law, because the law taught society how to hate with official permission. And speaking of official permission, Britain's medical establishment has its own disturbing moments where the line between treatment and harm becomes blurred by authority. Moment 83. Medical experiments and ethics. When the patient has no power. The setup is medicine advancing, often genuinely saving lives, but the pivot arrives when patients have little choice, little information, or little social power. Across modern history, there are documented cases where vulnerable groups, prisoners, institutionalized patients, the poor, are subjected to treatments or experiments without adequate consent or transparency. The exact examples vary by decade and institution, and not every allegation is equally supported. But the pattern of ethical blind spots is real, visible in later reforms, scandals, and the evolving concept of informed consent. The disturbing part is that authority can make harm feel like normal procedure. A doctor in a white coat is trusted, and trust, when unaccountable, can become dangerous. The consequence is a bitter lesson. Medical progress is not automatically moral progress. It requires restraint, transparency, and respect. And those are choices, not inevitabilities. And speaking of choices, Britain's choice to manage poverty through punishment rather than support keeps resurfacing, even in the modern welfare state. Moment 84. Benefits scrounger. Culture. When hunger is moralized again. The setup is economic pressure and political rhetoric. Welfare exists, and so does the debate over who deserves it. The pivot is when public narrative turns recipients into villains. Media stories and political language can paint people on benefits as lazy, fraudulent, or morally defective. This shapes policy, stricter conditions, sanctions, and systems that make survival more difficult for those already struggling. The details vary by era and government, and debates about welfare are complex, but the human impact of punitive systems is consistently documented through social research and the testimony of those affected. The disturbing aspect is the repetition. It's the same philosophy as the workhouse wearing different clothing. Make relief unpleasant and fewer will seek it. That idea does not die easily. And the consequence is a society that treats need as suspicion, and then acts surprised when people fall through the cracks it deliberately widened. Meanwhile, one of Britain's most disturbing modern moments involves fire, not as execution, not as war, but as the lethal meeting point of negligence, inequality, and bureaucracy. Moment 85. Grenfell. When a building becomes a trap, 2017. The setup is a high-rise residential tower, people living normal lives, trusting that their homes meet safety standards. The pivot is a fire that spreads with terrifying speed, turning escape routes into hazards. The Grenfell Tower fire becomes a symbol not only of tragedy, but of systemic failure. Building materials, oversight, decisions made long before the night of the fire. Investigations and inquiry processes explore how safety warnings were raised, how regulations were interpreted, and how residents' concerns were treated. This is documented through inquiry evidence, testimony, and the public record of scrutiny. The disturbing part is that the catastrophe feels preventable. It carries the signature of negligence, the sense that the people living there were not treated as voices worth listening to until they were screaming. The consequence is not only grief, it is a national confrontation with inequality, whose housing is built safely, whose warnings are respected, and whose lives are quietly placed at risk by decisions made far away. And if you think that is the limit of modern institutional failure, remember that Britain's most disturbing moments often come in pairs. First the harm, then the struggle to admit it. Moment 86. The long inquiry. When the process feels like another punishment after major tragedies, The setup is often reassurance. Inquiries will find the truth, accountability will follow, reforms will be made. The pivot is time. Years can pass, families attend hearings, listen to technical language, relive trauma repeatedly. The process becomes exhausting, sometimes feeling like a second ordeal layered on top of the first. Transparency matters, but so does speed. And when the system moves slowly, it can feel as if it is waiting for grief to run out. This pattern appears across multiple British disasters and scandals. The evidence is in the timelines of inquiries and the voices of families who describe how justice delayed can feel like justice denied. The disturbing consequence is that systems can use procedure as protection, not always deliberately, but effectively. If accountability is complex enough, it may never arrive in a form that feels real. And speaking of forms that don't feel real, Britain's history includes moments where the state's violence becomes so distant, so overseas, that the public barely registers it as violence at all. Moment 87. Distant wars, quiet deaths. When empire's costs were not counted at home, the setup is empire and global reach. Britain fights wars far from its own streets, campaigns in Africa, Asia, the Middle East. Official narratives emphasize strategy and prestige. The pivot is whose deaths are counted as real. British casualties are memorialized rightly, with ceremonies and stone. Colonial casualties, civilians, local soldiers, communities caught in conflict often become statistics, if they are recorded at all. This is documented in the uneven archival record and the way commemoration historically prioritized British lives. The disturbing part is not the existence of war memorials, it's the selective empathy. A life becomes more grievable when it resembles the people writing the history, and the consequence is a distorted moral map where violence abroad feels abstract and therefore easier to repeat. Meanwhile, Britain's own streets have seen moments where violence becomes intimate again, where communities are attacked not by foreign enemies but by neighbours convinced they are defending something. Moment 88. Race riots and community terror. When fear becomes a mob, the setup is social tension, economic hardship, housing pressure, political rhetoric and racism simmering under the surface. The pivot is eruption. In different periods of modern British history, riots and attacks target minority communities. Homes and businesses are threatened. People are assaulted. The violence is often justified by perpetrators as defending neighbourhoods or protecting jobs, as if a punch can solve unemployment. The evidence appears in police records, contemporary reporting, and the lived memory of communities that endured it. The disturbing part is the moral gymnastics. People claim righteousness while terrorizing neighbours, and the consequence is lasting mistrust and trauma, plus the knowledge that belonging in Britain has often been conditional and sometimes violently contested. And speaking of conditional belonging, Britain's relationship with refugees and migrants includes moments where the border becomes not only a line, but a weapon. Moment 89. The border as punishment, detention, dehumanization and delay. The setup is migration, people moving for work, safety, family survival. Governments claim the need for control. The pivot is when control becomes cruelty. Detention centres, hostile environments, prolonged uncertainty, and policies that treat asylum seekers and migrants as problems rather than humans create a system where suffering is a deterrent. The logic is old. If the process is miserable, fewer will come. The human cost is visible in testimony, advocacy reports, and public debate. This is not a simple topic, but the disturbing thread in British history is consistent. The state repeatedly uses hardship as policy lever, whether it's workhouses, internment, or hostile paperwork. The mechanism is the same, and the consequence is a society that teaches itself to associate vulnerability with suspicion. Meanwhile, Britain's most disturbing moments also include the ones that look like progress, because progress can hide its own casualties. Moment 90. Industrial. Progress. Deadly workplaces as normality. The setup is industry, factories, construction, transport. Britain builds itself with labour. The pivot is the routine acceptance of death and injury as the price. For much of industrial history, workplace safety is minimal. Fatal accidents, lung diseases, toxic exposures, these are not rare, they are expected. Reform comes slowly, often after pressure from unions, campaigners, and public scandal. We know this from health records, reports, and the long history of occupational disease. The disturbing part is the moral shrug, that certain bodies, usually working-class bodies, are treated as expendable inputs, and the consequence is a kind of invisible massacre spread over decades, not on a battlefield but in workshops, mines, and building sites. And speaking of invisible massacres, Britain has another category of disturbing moment, when the state intervenes in personal life and calls it protection, even as it breaks people in the process. Moment 91, children taken, identities erased, the dark side of welfare. The setup is often framed as rescue. A child in a poor home, a child in a troubled family, a child whose parents are judged unfit. The pivot is what happens when judgment becomes a conveyor belt. Across British history, child removal, whether through welfare systems, institutions, or forced migration schemes, has sometimes been driven not only by genuine protection concerns, but by class prejudice, moral panic, or the convenience of removing problem children from sight. The details vary across periods, and some programs were explicitly justified as improving lives. But later, testimony and inquiries reveal repeated patterns of harm, abuse in care, loss of identity, separation from siblings, and the lifelong wound of being told your family was disposable. We know this from historical records, survivor accounts, and the public inquiries that have, in various contexts, exposed institutional failure. The disturbing element is the quietness. There is no dramatic public execution. There is paperwork, social workers, transport, new names, new files, and a child grows up not knowing where they came from. And speaking of origins erased, Britain's colonial system sometimes did the same at scale, moving children, reshaping communities, and insisting it was for their own good. Moment 92. Cultural erasure in empire, when language and identity were treated as obstacles. The setup is the imperial civilizing mission, schools, missions, administration. The pivot is that education becomes an instrument of erasure. In parts of the empire, colonial schooling and governance pressure local languages, customs, and identities. Sometimes this is subtle. Prestige attached to English, economic incentives. Sometimes it is coercive, punishment for speaking native languages, suppression of traditions, reshaping of history, narratives to centre British authority. The historical record is uneven across colonies, but the pattern is documented in policy, missionary writings, and the memories preserved by colonised communities. The disturbing part is that you can conquer a person without killing them, if you can convince them their own culture is shameful or inferior. The consequence is generational. Languages weaken, traditions break, and people are forced to rebuild identity under the weight of someone else's contempt. And speaking of contempt, Britain's own class system has long had a brutal relationship with the poor, especially when poverty becomes visible in ways that embarrass the respectable. Moment 93. Slum clearances, improvement that displaced the poor again. The setup is urban reform. Victorian and later authorities look at overcrowded slums and acknowledge, sometimes sincerely, that conditions are horrific. Disease spreads, housing is unsafe. The pivot is what clearance means. Slums are demolished, but replacement housing is often inadequate, too expensive, or too slow to arrive. Communities are scattered. People are pushed into other overcrowded areas. The city cleans up its image without necessarily solving the underlying poverty that created the slum. This is documented in municipal records, reform reports, and the history of urban development. The disturbing part is that improvement can function as displacement. You remove the poor from view, declare victory, and congratulate yourself on sanitation. Meanwhile, the people you displaced still need somewhere to live, And speaking of sanitation, Britain's public health history includes both genuine triumph and chilling indifference, especially when the victims are the already marginal. Moment 94. Epidemics in the industrial city. When the poor died first. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, industrial Britain is repeatedly hit by diseases that thrive in overcrowding and poverty. The setup is rapid urbanisation, people packed into poor housing, limited clean water, inadequate waste systems. The pivot is that disease becomes a class phenomenon. The wealthy can move to cleaner streets, access better care, or simply live in houses with space and sanitation. The poor cannot. Mortality concentrates where vulnerability concentrates. Reformers document conditions and eventually public health measures expand. Clean water, sewage systems, sanitation laws. The disturbing part is the delay. It often takes repeated waves of death and the fear that disease might spread upward to trigger reforms that could have been pursued earlier on moral grounds alone. And the consequence is a grim reminder. Societies often act fastest not when the vulnerable suffer, but when the powerful feel threatened. And speaking of threats, Britain's fear of disorder repeatedly turns into violence, sometimes delivered by the state, sometimes by crowds, sometimes by the uneasy partnership of both. Moment 95. Law and order. Riots. When policing and community collide. The setup is tension between police and communities, often working-class communities, often minority communities where experiences of harassment, discrimination, or heavy-handed tactics accumulate. The pivot is eruption. Riots and disturbances in modern Britain have varied causes and context, and each has its own specific history. But the recurring pattern is that policing can become not a shield but a spark, especially when communities already feel targeted. Violence follows, damage follows, and then comes the familiar cycle. Condemnation, commissions, promises, partial reforms, and the slow return to normal conditions. Conditions that may still contain the original grievance. This is documented through public inquiries, media coverage, and sociological research. The disturbing part is not the existence of conflict, it's the predictability. When people feel unheard, the pressure builds. When authority responds with force rather than listening, it often amplifies the very anger it fears. And speaking of fear, Britain's relationship with terrorism and the response to it introduces another set of disturbing moral trade-offs. Moment 96. Anti-terror powers. When emergency becomes permanent. The setup is real. Terrorism creates fear and grief, and governments are expected to protect the public. The pivot is that protective measures can mutate into permanent expansions of power, detention, surveillance, restrictions on movement, broad definitions of extremism. Policies created for rare emergencies become normal tools, and because the target is terror, a word with no fixed shape, the scope of the response can expand indefinitely. This is documented through legislation and public debate. The disturbing part is not that governments respond, it's that emergency becomes a habit. Once the public accepts extraordinary powers, it becomes difficult to roll them back, because the argument is always ready. What if we need them again? And speaking of again, one of the most disturbing threads in British history is how often it repeats itself, only with new technology, new language, and the same old instincts. Moment 97. The machine of scandal. When institutions choose self-protection over people, the setup is a scandal. Abuse in an institution, corruption in an agency, negligence in a service. The pivot is the first response, denial. A familiar sequence appears again and again. Victims report harm. Authorities minimize it. Investigations are resisted. Documents are hard to find. Then, after years, the truth becomes undeniable. Apologies arrive. Reforms are promised. This pattern is documented across many British contexts. The disturbing part is not only the initial harm, it is the second harm. The way institutions often make survivors fight for recognition. They are treated like nuisances, liars, opportunists. And when vindication comes, it arrives with no return of time, health, or lost loved ones. The consequence is deep cynicism, justified cynicism about authority. People learn that truth is not enough. You must also have power. And speaking of power, Britain's historical power rests heavily on one more recurring mechanism, the ability to define what is civilized, then punish anyone who disagrees. Moment 98. Civilization as justification, when moral language hides violence. The setup is Britain describing itself. Lawful, fair, civilized, orderly. The pivot is what those words have been used to excuse. In domestic context, civilization can mean punishing the poor for being poor. In colonial context, civilization can mean taking land and calling it improvement. In war, civilization can mean bombing, starving, or detaining, and then insisting it's different from what barbaric enemies do. This is not a claim that Britain is uniquely evil. It is a claim that moral language is often a mask for power. The evidence lies in speeches, proclamations, laws, and the repeated gap between stated ideals and lived reality. The disturbing consequence is that people can participate in harm while feeling virtuous. That is the most dangerous kind of harm, because it doesn't look like harm to the person doing it. And speaking of virtue, Britain's national story often leans hard on the idea of fair play. There is a disturbing moment when fair play is tested and fails, when the poor ask for dignity and are offered only discipline. Moment 99. The workhouse afterlife. Stigma that outlived the walls. Even as workhouses decline and the welfare state grows, the setup remains. A society deciding how much compassion is too much. The pivot is cultural continuity. The stigma of poverty, the idea that needing help is shameful, survives long after the original institutions fade. The poor are expected to prove deservingness, to perform gratitude, to accept suspicion as routine. This is visible in policy language, media narratives, and the way people talk about those who struggle. The disturbing part is that the workhouse isn't only a building. It becomes a mindset, and a mindset can outlive bricks by centuries. And speaking of mindsets, one of the most chilling British habits is the way it often reacts to its own disturbing history, not by grappling with it, but by smoothing it into a story that feels comfortable. Moment 100. The national amnesia. When history is polished until it shines, the setup is national identity. People want stories that make them feel proud. Britain has plenty of achievements: literature, science, parliamentary tradition, resistance to tyranny in certain moments. The pivot is what gets edited out to preserve pride. The uncomfortable moments, famine policies, colonial violence, institutional abuse, class cruelty, are minimized, disputed into exhaustion, or treated as complex in a way that quietly means, please stop talking. The evidence of this amnesia is cultural. What is taught, what is celebrated, what is turned into heritage attractions without moral discomfort. The disturbing consequence is repetition. If you don't teach how harm happened, you don't recognize it when it returns. You only recognize the costumes, and history is very good at changing costumes, which brings us to the last disturbing moment, not a single event, but the fact that after all of this, people still ask for a neat moral ending. Moment 101. The most disturbing moment, how easily people adapt. Here is the quietest horror. The setup is human resilience, often praised as a virtue. People endure, they carry on, they survive wars, poverty, injustice, and loss. The pivot is what resilience can allow. A society can adapt to cruelty. It can normalize injustice. It can learn to live with suffering as background noise. People can accept the unacceptable, not because they are evil, but because life demands routine, and routine dulls outrage. This is documented not in a single archive, but in patterns across centuries. How quickly punishment becomes entertainment, how easily poverty becomes criminal, how often empire becomes adventure, how institutions protect themselves while apologizing later with polished words. The disturbing truth is that the machinery of harm doesn't always require villains. It only requires people willing to look away, to accept explanations, to believe that if something is legal, it must be right, and if something is distant, it must not be theirs to worry about. And that is why remembering matters, even for sleep, because memory is one of the few things power cannot fully control. So now, in the quiet after these 101 moments, notice what they have in common. It isn't a single villain or a single era. It's a set of habits, patterns that repeat with different faces. The habit of calling punishment order, the habit of treating hunger as a moral failing, the habit of confusing law with justice and paperwork with innocence, the habit of believing violence is only violence when it looks dramatic, not when it looks administrative. History doesn't move in a straight line from darkness into light. It circles, it returns, it tests the same weaknesses in new forms. The workhouse becomes a sanction, the plantation becomes an emergency camp, the public execution becomes a media smear, the empire becomes a policy that treats distance like permission. And yet, there's another pattern too. People resist, survivors speak, families refuse silence, reformers document what authorities want forgotten. Sometimes justice arrives late, limping, imperfect, exhausted, but it arrives because someone kept dragging it forward, inch by inch, against the weight of denial. If you're listening to this to sleep, let the facts settle gently, not like stones, but like reminders that comfort is often built on someone else's discomfort, and that the only way not to repeat the worst moments is to recognize them while they're still small, while they're still just a phrase in a speech, a rule in a policy, a decision made for the greater good. Sleep now if you can with the calm knowledge that remembering is not the same as despair. Remembering is how you keep your eyes open, so that when history tries to return wearing a new costume, you can say softly but firmly, "I know what you are, and I won't look away."